start going through the overview. But we had some really great questions coming at the beginning of the last call. One person asked, what's the benefit of becoming a development ready community? And I think one of the goals is to really figure out a structure, a better way for the state and municipalities to be working together to get funding and technical assistance into the places where local communities would like to see that investment go. And so, I think if this can work, it would really create a mechanism for targeted funding for projects within towns that would help invest in, some of the places that you see when you drive around the state, where we have some of our, best buildings that reflect just a really great building tradition and heritage kind of crumbling at the centers of a lot of our communities. And we've talked a lot about the costs of various development patterns and the kind of is financially in the long run. So this is really about trying to figure out a framework that can help target investment and produce outcomes, because so much of what we do, I think the working relationship between the state and municipalities is really is about planning, which is important too, but we need to get to the point where we're really focused on outcomes. And so this is attempting to do that. Another question is, how is this different from what's happening now? And I think I kind of touched on that, but again, it's getting the investment into the hands of communities, into the parts of the community where there's a positive return on investment and where the community has identified that they'd like to see that investment. We talked a lot or heard a lot on the last call about how this framework seems to be prioritized for urban areas. And I think that's absolutely not the goal. This is really meant to be a framework to help direct funding into all the different kinds of communities we have across the state, from the smallest towns and hamlets to, our rural communities that might not even, have a village center or even a crossroads, and then all the way to our, our biggest cities. And I think, a big part of this call that we're hoping to get from people is input on how we can structure the framework so that it really is balanced and that we have a nuanced approach. It's not a one-size-fits-all where we have the same set of rules regardless of the community, but really looking at what are the types of places that each community has, and are there priority development areas within those communities, and what are the criteria based on the kind of priority development areas and the patterns of development that people are trying to reinforce, that, how can those kind of places drive the criteria to make sure that we're only asking towns to do what's necessary for them to get the kind of investment that they're looking for. And it really is a question of scale. So I hope we can talk more about that today. Someone asked which places won't fit into the priority, the framework. And I think that the idea is to look at the priority development areas, which again, we'll look at more closely in a minute, and try to think through whether we've gotten all the kinds of places that we really want to target development. And I think we'll find that most communities will have at least one of those kinds of areas, if not multiple. But that's the question we're trying to answer. Another question was, most towns won't be able to address the criteria. And again, I think the criteria that are in the draft, it is sort of a blanket right now, but we really do want to look at those carefully and try to figure out how do we align those criteria with different types of communities that have different types of priority development areas. So we're hoping to refine those. So those were some of the big questions. The other was really the role of regional organizations, and Like Mandy mentioned, we're hoping to dig into that a little bit more, and it's great to know that we have a number of people from various regional entities on the line, and a part of that conversation is really also about funding, and how can we redirect existing funding or identify new sources of funding to help support all the various levels of government and the actual investment into the projects. So with that, I will share my screen and we can start going through the document.
Yeah, Kara, we've got, wait, am I on? Yeah. Another question that has come up. One version seems to identify hamlets as a priority area. Another I've seen uses, quote, crossroads. So are these the same?
Okay, good question. So this is a fast moving process. And so we are updating the draft in between these phone calls. So last week's draft had hamlets. This week's draft has crossroads. Nomenclature is always an interesting conversation and can be a very spirited conversation. So would love to hear people's reaction. It's the same place type, different name. So we'll get into that a little bit more, but that's a great question. All right. So let's see if I can do this. Okay. So hopefully everyone can see this. And this, again, I know some of you have read this, but I'm just going to try to give a broad overview for those who haven't. But the intent, again, of this framework is to try to figure out how to align state goals and funding with local priorities, and to create an investment-based model that is really driving at outcomes and getting funding into the parts of communities where there's a positive return on investment and where the community has identified they'd like to see investment. So in one sense, it involves getting various state level entities to make sure that they're kind of all moving in the same direction, and then creating this set of criteria that communities need to comply with in order to gain access to state funding. And it's a baseline set of criteria and then potentially some additional criteria to help with scoring. And once you become qualified as a development ready community, then you have access to funding. And I think a big part of this is, again, making sure that existing funding sources are directed toward the places where there's the positive return on investment, but then also that there's some new funding in place for projects that currently are having trouble because the numbers don't work, the development numbers, where the rents aren't supported, and the construction costs are too high. So that's new construction of small scale housing. It's just not happening in a lot of our communities because there's nothing to fill that gap in financing. So these are all, playing into this conversation about how do we get projects and investment in all of our towns across the state. And this conversation is timely because of the Governor's Climate Council work that's happening, and the state economic and community development plan that's hot off the presses. And then there's also a housing task force that's just been initiated. There's a Blue Ribbon Commission looking at how we fund our transportation infrastructure, which we've largely overbuilt. Yes. And there's also an age-friendly advisory committee that's looking at walkability and how we make communities work for people of all ages. So there's just a lot going on right now, and this is really trying to tie together all the land use pieces. This is something I put together to try to address a question that came out of last week, and it might not be helpful. And I don't even know if this is in the draft you guys saw, but basically from the top down, there's program funding that needs to happen, whether it's from existing state programs or new funding streams, which we can talk about more. And then there would be a state program management entity. And then also the COGS or regional organizations would be assisting with supporting the municipalities. And those communities would do the work they need to figure out where they want their priority or where their priority development areas are, and do the other baseline requirements for their type of community. And then they would gain access to funding for local projects, which would increase the tax revenue, TIF revenue, which would feed back into the system. So the idea is that this should be a closed loop system, if possible, so that there is a way to self-fund the work, and you're increasing, the economic potential to help feed back into that. So that's my first draft take of trying to kind of map that out. So on the state side, there's some work that needs to happen to organize between departments, which is already, I think there's already a lot of work happening in that area, and really focused on place-based criteria for investment. I think that's a big concept here. And this is all stuff that people should take a moment to read. So on the state side, there's two real big buckets. There's the technical assistance and the financial investment. So the technical assistance could happen with the support of the regional councils of government or the regional entities, and that would involve management, technical support for planning, and technical support for real estate development. And this is a big piece that, there's a lot of information that communities could be empowered with that in the realm of real estate development that could help them, build up their own network of small scale developers in their communities, or help provide the information for developers to get projects going. And then the financial investment, which is money to put directly toward projects, whether it's projects on private land or street projects that help support that private investment. The goal is to really have communities looking at the entire scope of the place, the entire picture of what they're hoping to see. And oftentimes it's, both transportation and land use, the street space and the private lots along the street. So thinking about that as a total package. And then, this is a section placeholder. Hopefully we'll fill this in after today's call. And we can have a more robust conversation about the role of the regional level of government. And then this is sort of a pin in it for later, but there's been some comments coming up about what are other incentives that could be paired with this program. So if you have a development ready place in a priority development area and you're proposing projects, what might you get relief from? And this came up a lot in the systems mapping work we did starting in August, where people are identifying environmental rules that are really driving design and development, and creating a more suburban kind of low density pattern, even in places where communities might want it to be, more of a downtown feel, more walkable. And it's really hard for that traditional pattern of development to happen because of some of the DEP rules. So that's a conversation we can hopefully dig into. And then on the DOT side, site distance rules can sometimes impede the ability to create a network of streets. And again, it's very context sensitive. And so starting to think more about what are some some rules like that that might be relaxed in a more urban village environment. And that's really just the beginning of a brainstorm there. This is kind of a really important piece of this, and I hope everyone can take a close look at this, and I'd like to kind of open this up to a more interactive conversation. But this is a draft of potential priority development areas that most communities probably have one or more of. And the idea is that you would identify within your own town or city which of these areas you have, what the extent of them are. And then these are the places where you would do the bulk of your comprehensive planning, essentially, and your work to really figure out what is it that you collectively as a community would like to see happen in these areas. What do you want it to look like? What kind of buildings would you like to see? What kind of streets would you like to see? What kind of public spaces? What would those all look like? And then, you know, this becomes the basis for zoning changes or development standards to help provide that direction and open the door for investment. And then these are also the areas that would be available for, you know, investment dollars from the state. So since last week, just tried to make these a little, we got a lot of really great feedback on these. So tried to make some changes to clarify what, you know, would qualify as a downtown versus, you know, a village center that, you know, there's more space between the buildings, versus a crossroads, which is really just like a tiny moment where there's a collection of buildings that could be a variety of uses. And then the high impact corridor is sort of that first ring of, it's a linear collection of mostly commercial buildings that cropped up mostly in the 80s and 90s, and it's still happening today, but starting then when a lot of towns created commercial corridors in their use-based zoning codes. And a lot of these are adjacent to neighborhoods and within reasonable proximity to a downtown, and just a lot of turnover and potential for an increased mix of uses and more build out along what was a pretty you know, big infrastructure investment. Adjacent neighborhoods are, you know, something that you might see more in some of the larger urban areas where it's a mostly residential area adjacent to a downtown. And then the rural farmstead is, you know, some of these more rural communities in Maine don't have a downtown, might have a small crossroads, but have a lot of potential for economic development that's land-based, and what might that look like in various communities, and how do we get resources into the hands of communities that, you know, have these mixed use agricultural, retail, commercial activities going on. And so with that, I would love to just take a pause and
hey, Kara, can you put that in presenter mode? People are having a hard time seeing. Just so that everybody knows too, I've just dropped the file into the chat for the file that Kara's looking at right now. So. Are you able to make it bigger?
what's that?
Are you able to make this the expand the,
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
I can't see the chat box, so I don't know if there's any questions coming in or not, but I can.
We've had a couple comments throughout. So John Shattuck says, obviously I'm biased, but I think that supporting the local RPO, including COGS and EDDs, in order to be a basic requirement for being certified funding eligible RRC. While funding will be at the municipal level, any intelligent assessment of ROI, benefits, and impacts need to include a regional perspective. I have another question. Sorry, Karen, I'm muting you. How much detail is there on provision of healthcare in various communities?
Provision of what?
Healthcare?
In various what?
Communities?
I don't know that I understand.
So Jim has responded with healthcare service provision is a best practice standard. So this seems like something we could consider. Yeah.
Stick a pin in that. I'll look at it later. So if no one has any more thoughts on this right now, and I would encourage anyone to send me comments on the PDF. We can go I'll do a quick overview of the criteria, and then we can talk about the regional role, and then we can go back and talk about these criteria, but I'll just do a quick kind of summary of these. These are the criteria, draft form, that communities would be asked to go through and respond to in order to become certified as a development-ready community. And once certified, they would then gain access to funding for projects within those areas. So there.
We do have another question. Who will be doing the reviews? Sorry. Who will be doing the reviews of these plans and determining if they're meeting the standards for development ready communities?
Yeah, I don't have the answer to that. We're hoping to get some involvement from the state, so we might be able to have some better ideas of how that might work. But I think that's, at this point, an open question, a good question. So the criteria, and I won't go through these now, but involve criteria related to comprehensive planning. And someone asked earlier about comprehensive planning, and I think there's been some interesting conversations happening about whether our current framework rules, enabling rules for comp planning make sense at this moment in time. They're fairly onerous and exhaustive and analysis based, and I think this provides an opportunity to help focus on some of the pieces of the comp planning enabling rules that really can help communities move forward to outcomes past the planning, and really, work together as communities on the land use conversations, and transportation is sort of a multidisciplinary conversation, and dig into where do you want growth to happen, what do you want it to look like, how do you set yourself up to succeed at getting that investment and those outcomes that you're looking for. So, perhaps this is part of a larger conversation about comp planning that seems to be happening, which is great. The Maine Association of Planners are having this conversation. So it's all, I think the time is right for these bigger conversations. So, this provides, I think, if you dig into it, some of maybe what you could consider the key questions that could be the focus of comp planning work. One of them here is financial standards and trying to make sure that communities understand the value per acre for different development patterns so that they're putting their own resources into the kinds of development that has a positive return for them in the long run. Public participation, making sure, you know, as you're having really important conversations about the future of your town, people from a variety of backgrounds and abilities to participate are involved in some way, and their opinions are sought and incorporated.
Okay, a couple things. So we've had some questions in the chat, mostly related to the sorry, I'm gonna mute you when I'm talking. Your speakers are not good. So who will be doing the reviews of these plans? I asked that. And Vanessa commented, would that not be the part of the structure of the state role? To which Jim replied, I don't mean to like overdo this, but Jim said assessments, not plans. And Jim agrees that it should be an interagency and or government certifying body. So it would be great if you could just touch on that just a little bit more, sort of who will be looking at it and why, what they're looking for. Also, we have a couple of people that want to have a discussion. So I just want to open it up, you know, while Kara's talking. I think everybody should feel free to unmute themselves and just sort of ask their questions if they'd like. I'll try to keep notes by just putting it out to everybody in the chat box so that we have this for later. Okay.
Yeah, I guess I would like to just open it up to conversation at this point. I think the rest of the criteria helps to take a look at those closely, and maybe we can just get into this conversation about the role of the regional entities, because I think there's a lot of energy around that conversation. And I guess someone had mentioned early on that there's more than just COGS, and we've had a little bit of back and forth on that. So does anyone have any opinions about whether the regional entity should be more than the COGS? And I'm not entirely clear whether there are areas that don't have COGS or not. I think there's a little disagreement on that.
SMPDC is not a COG. We're a regional planning commission. So unless you want to call everybody a COG and then define what a COG is for the purposes of this document, then you're not all inclusive at this point.
So this is Ian. Cara, I sent you a clarifying email. I think you had an earlier comment from Jane as well on that topic. I think it would be helpful to get the COGS and regional planning commissions to weigh in here. They're, in my mind, they're somewhat equivalent. I tend to just call them COGS, but I may be incorrect there, but I don't think they cross over.
There is crossover. State law, specifically the Growth Management Act, calls us regional councils. The Maine Department of Transportation has transitioned to more of an economic development administration terminology and calls us RPOs, regional planning organizations. So if you're going to use it, if you're going to classify us, it should be one of those two, rather than RPCs or COGS. Or the entire state is covered by economic development districts. Some of our agencies are economic development districts, And in some districts, some EDDs, there's more than one regional council serving that EDD, that economic development district.
Yeah, this is Lee J again. I'll actually add on to that Joan just talked about, because, for example, we have Old Orchard, Saco, Biddeford, and Arundel are in our planning area, but they're in the PAX planning district for transportation. So there's an overlap that exists there as well.
Now, would that be the difference between a regional planning commission and regional planning versus the metropolitan planning organization, MPOs versus RPOs?
No, it's not an MPO versus RPO. It's our regional council versus RPO. Metropolitan planning organizations are a different. They're a different animal. Many of them live within the COGS, but not, or within the RPOs, but not all of them. Like Bangor area, MPO is on its own. It's not housed at Eastern Maine Development Corporation. It's in its own office. It's a 501c3. So I would stay away from any of the MPO or MTA or TMA labels.
You also have economic development districts, which in some cases may have overlap as well. It wasn't until a few years ago that we were part of the EDD associated with Portland area with the GP cog, and then we ended up becoming our own EDD. And I think that still exists up in the mid-coast area where the EDD exists, but the Council of Governments is, I don't want to say non-existent, but I'm not sure how big of a role they actually play.
I think you see the greatest divergence between regional councils and economic development districts in the mid-coast and in the Bangor area and down east, where you have the smaller regional planning organizations.
Do you think that there's a what should we be calling what Carr is talking about? And I guess I try to evaluate it for myself. Excuse me, I've got to mute. Sorry, I had to break there for a second. Lee J, when you guys I think about it in this way. The Southern Maine Planning Regional Development Commission reviewed our CDBG application for our competitive award with the state this year, and what entity for DECD reviewed that, Lee?
I couldn't tell you. I would assume it was the EDD portion, our economic development portion of that, because that's where the CDBG money comes into in our organization. Chuck Morgan is our economic development specialist, and he runs that program.
Okay, so maybe that's not the right example there. I think, as I understood it, for Carr's sake, trying to have some sort of review process from a regional organization that would meet these development criteria. But that's just my minimal understanding of the concept here. But that's the end of my questions.
I think if we use the RPO, Regional Planning Organization, then we capture all of the planning entities that are not COGS or RPCs. It picks up everybody. It covers the entire state. It's consistent with how Maine DOT is referring to us at this point. I do CDBG technical assistance, Ian, for the Androscoggin Valley Council of Governments region, which is most of Oxford County, Androscoggin County, and Franklin County. and they don't identify us. I don't even have a written contract. We have an agreement, but they're not using the term at all. So I'm not sure your answer can be found looking at the CDBG program.
I just want to state that as like a representative of DOT, my personal opinion would be to back what Joan is saying. I think calling them RPOs is a lot easier than calling them COGs and trying to define that. I think it's going to cause confusion, and I think it's just a more straightforward way. I mean, I've always known them as regional planning organizations as an overall, but that just happens to be what I've only been at the department for a year, and that's just what I was trying to call them.
See, and I hearken back to planning law, and as I understand, so the Council of Governments were, set up by, I think it was through the Department of Agriculture, and they pretty much divided the whole country into those partitions, and then they layered on the MPOs or the regional planning organizations to address transportation. But it may not matter, at this point. But those were my thought. My comments on it. But RPO, if that's the way we can do it, that sounds great.
I mean, the difference between an RPC and a COG is in how it's structured. How many representatives are, as we say in our world, how many General Assembly members are elected officials versus appointed officials, or just residents of our member communities. So my understanding is the major difference between RPC and a COG is that governmental structure for each of those entities.
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, I just did a Google search of the MRSAs, and if you look at Title 38, 2321, that defines the establishment of a regional planning commission and development district. I don't know if there's anything else that establishes COGS per se under state law, but 2321 under MRSA 30A defines what a regional planning and development district is.
Yeah, and George O'Keefe just sent this map across. I don't know if everyone can see my screen. Let me just try and make it here.
A lovely map, yes.
Sorry, it's not going to go correct. No.
Yep, I did.
Sorry. But essentially, this is the COGS and the planning commissions. I mean, Jim's comment from earlier talks about, using regional entities. So it seems like we're sort of talking about this, not dancing around it, but that's definitely something that needs to be fleshed out. But I think that it sounds like everyone's kind of in agreement that the regional is the way to go for this type of conversation. Is that correct?
Well, I think it's really when we're talking about what the regional level is, what is that level? I think there's roles for various levels of government, but this is a really helpful conversation. This is great. Does anyone have any other thoughts on the regional, the proper regional entity?
Kara, everyone, this is Carl.
Yep.
I just, maybe I missed it somewhere in the writing, or the importance of buy-in from municipal levels, whether or not they're, alike municipalities, like similarly sized cities, or similarly suburbanized suburban communities, or similarly similar in their thinking that they're rural communities, because land use is at the end of the day all regulated primarily. There are some state and regional incentives at best, but at the end of the day, the land use and the development is regulated by the municipality. So I don't know if I missed the connection between that and operationalizing this at the regional level.
Yeah, I think the idea is that the regional entities could be strengthened, empowered, funded to help provide technical assistance, especially to communities that have fewer resources. But yeah, you're right. I mean, this has to be a local conversation, and it's really about how do you get the tools and the funding.
I can get my head around as far as the regionals coordinating and you know, they already have the relationships with the municipalities, some better than others, especially as you go into more rural areas. They can be stronger because the rurals depend on the regionals, or they can be much weaker because a larger municipality, city doesn't initially think it needs the regional or the city or the COG or the RPC. So it's just, I think we need to keep that in mind, that getting broad support for this will require kind of working with similar or similarly aligned municipalities to come up with what works for them. When we did, I think Lee J alluded to this, when we did Sustain Southern Maine a decade ago, or almost a decade ago, we had to come up with customized planning and incentives and rules by center, by just a segment of a town, or in some cases, an area that's shared by two towns. And that alone was extremely challenging, but we did get there as far as getting agreement on some of the sticks and carrots that would work for that area, or that, you know, that planning area. But that was a subset of, and you're familiar with this, when you were involved with Portland's when we did around the transportation center. So it's just, the point is that how do we, the big lift I see for this is getting, conceptually it works great, and I think people could get buy into it, but it would have to have a lot of understanding that that regionals and the towns included work together to come up with a way to operationalize it. And that's exactly what we did with Sustain Southern Maine. And it seemed to work, but it's a lengthy process. And if there's money involved that can trickle down from the state, then there's more chance for it to be successful.
So Carl, this is Ian. I'm the development ready communities isn't what I'm primarily working in, but I listened in last time, and as I understand it, as I conceptualize this, it's development ready. So the idea is to work at a regional level to establish a decision-making process. So when dealing with scarce state and federal resources, there's a decision-making process at a regional level so that those scarce allocated resources can be funneled to those communities that are specifically development ready. And you know, for example, the for example, I'd say SMPDC, they already have a board of, you know, that representative group, so they can go through that process of you know, a local municipality such as Sanford saying, yes, you know, we think we're development ready, and we're, you know, applying for a state grant. Are we consistent with the objectives of the regional standards?
Yeah, and just to reiterate, I think on the local level, the key thing is the investment piece, and creating the mechanism, like you mentioned, you know, having the funding, so that when communities go through the process, at the end of it, there's access to funding, and during it, there's access to the technical support they need.
And that's the exact model that the MPOs work with. You know, they have the money to do the help with the planning, and then ultimately to fund transportation. So that's, again, with Sustain Southern Maine, that was the model, and the federal government worked through the MPOs to try and come up with a planning structure and framework. The missing piece at the end of all that was actually operationalizing priority funding. And some municipalities are hesitant to exclude the ability to use federal funds in certain areas of their jurisdiction, within their town boundaries. And at PAX, we tried to do this, to limit it to just within the priority investment areas. And the pushback came from exactly that, of being limited to be able to spend those dollars anywhere within the municipality. So I mentioned to Kara on a sidebar, I don't know if she's read it yet, the yin and yang to this is priority conservation or priority natural resource areas. And then potentially having funds to go to do that as well. With what I learned at PAX and through the Sustained Southern Maine process, it was hard to have it be equitable even within one town when you're prioritizing dollars for developers. That's what it is at the end of the day, and the municipal partners, without having something else for the areas that are not going to get these funds. Make sense?
Yeah. As far as funding goes, there's been a number of different ideas put out there. George had an idea that he might want to share. I don't know, George.
So one of the possible approaches on funding that I thought of was a surcharge on construction and demolition debris that is sent to local transfer stations. Construction and demolition debris is really fundamentally an outcome of development. You have those types of flows of waste. So it's, in a way, I think it constitutes a user fee on development that then helps to support further development. Construction and demolition debris is handled on a fee basis by the local transfer stations differently. Some of them charge by weight, some of them charge by the size of the container, whether it's a passenger vehicle or a large dump truck. So my recommendation to the group would be for consideration of a 5% surcharge on construction and demolition debris fees. I'm encouraging consideration of a percentage basis approach as opposed to a flat fee, because it just allows the local fee structure to dictate the amount of revenue generated. But I think that in the modern context that we deal with in 2020, I think taxpayers are very sensitive to different approaches, and I think they typically are very more understanding or more supportive of approaches that are user-based fees than some other type of reallocation of revenues within the general fund. And I also think that in general, the public really appreciates it when we have revenue streams that are directed, that are generated from a single consistent source and then are directed to a single specific purpose. So also construction and demolition debris, because this is a fee at a local municipal facility, there's no sales tax or anything like that associated with it. So 5% surcharge, I think, would probably generate a pretty significant amount of revenue for the purposes of planning and development grants that could then be pushed down through the regional system, the RPOs. And I think that would be a structure that potentially gives us a starting point to work with, and also gives people some money to work with, and I think also has minimal impact on cost of development.
Cool. Yeah, and there's other ideas we're starting to look into too for funding, which is a separate conversation that if anyone is interested in digging in more on that, let us know. We're getting close to our wrap-up time. So if anyone has any other questions, definitely type them in. What I would love for people to do, if there's like a little bit of a homework assignment, it would be asking you all to take a moment to read the priority development area descriptions and criteria, to really think through whether those are the kind of places in our communities that we should be targeting investment. We haven't filled in the value per acre metrics yet, but because that's a separate work process that's happening now, so we can get to those numbers. But it's really about where are the places that have the best return on investment, which really means buildings are close together and taking advantage of the efficiency of the infrastructure that's in place. So that's sort of the high level. And the point is to not try to spread the investment everywhere, but to where you have that return. The other sort of homework assignment would be to look at the criteria, take a moment to read through them. Even if you can only read through the first 2 or 3, and think about how those criteria might apply differently in different types of communities. On one extreme, your cities that have a little bit of all of those conditions, all those different priority development areas, or communities that really just have mostly farmland and maybe a hamlet and no zoning. And so what are the criteria that make sense for those kinds of places? What do they need to do to be able to get to the place where it's clear what their investment priorities are, where those are, and what those should look like? So that's the kind of nuance we're trying to get into at this point in terms of the criteria. And we could use everyone's help in just thinking through, because everyone comes from different parts of the state and knows what your own conditions are and what you're kind of dealing with. So
Hey, Kara.
yeah.
When would you like the comments on the document?
When?
And how, yeah, when and how would you like them?
So commenting in Dropbox is great because everyone can see it, but it seems to be really sloggy and slow on the internet end of things. So if people can download the PDF and comment either handwritten, if you write neatly, and just, send photos or whatever, or if you can mark up a PDF in a PDF editor with comments that way, that's ideal, but not everyone has that software. So just whatever you can do to get me comments, but the Dropbox does not seem to be the best option, except for downloading.
Great. Well, thank you to everybody who joined today. Sorry about the sort of technical difficulties, but we are recording these webinars and putting them up on YouTube and trying to get them up on Facebook soon. We will be sending around an email probably early next week about the next meeting. And just want to give a shout out to Ann Ball at Maine Downtown Center / Maine Development Foundation for the use of their Zoom, which has been the last, like six weeks, and it's been super cool. So thanks everybody for joining, and looking forward to hearing from you with those comments. Have a good day.
Thank you.